Good.
Hey folks, if you want a full introduction to the ethics session and to how great Jimmy Adams is, go back and see the end of the Ego Network recording. Otherwise, just to let folks know that Jimmy Adams has a great book on data collection that just came out, and I guess we got about a year ago now, maybe two. Then COVID goes quickly. He's done a remarkable amount of work across lots of different contexts, which I think makes him uniquely situated to help us think through some of the ethical questions that have to do with network data collection and analysis. And so we're going to turn the floor over to you for a brief overview, Jimmy, and then we'll just jump in with questions and ideas.
Cool. So I'll apologize in advance. My dog is, he likes to be right outside and is a little loud right now. So anyway, so the main things I think are worth kind of highlighting at the outset that were in the presentation are that kind of most of our basic principles of ethics in kind of social science research apply here, but require some adaptation when you take them into the network context. So the kind of notion of consent, is very much set up as an individual level construct. And as soon as you start thinking about it in a relational sense, the kind of ways we've typically approached it need some adaptation. And this leads to kind of one of the big kind of overarching themes in ethical considerations of network data. And that is there isn't often a universal answer, and we're often left to kind of negotiate these things individually with our own IRBs and how we can apply them. There's some efforts afoot to try and maybe standardize a little bit of that, not so much to add new restrictions or new requirements, but in a sense of maybe producing a document that we could all take to IRBs and say, here's what INSNA has agreed upon as some base level standards. That's probably a ways off, but for whatever it's worth, that's something that is in discussions. The kind of risks of particularly kind of deductive disclosure are particularly unique in the network context. We like our visuals, and as you kind of start to present things like that, the way that deductive disclosure is often kind of problematic in individual level data sets becomes more complicated in the network context, because if you unravel the identity of one person, you often can unravel the identity of multiples. And so the kind of ways we apply these standards often need a reinterpretation for relational concepts in ways that I think are sometimes well thought through and sometimes are things that we're still figuring out as we go. But that leads to the third place, and that is kind of data uses raises kind of a third kind of bin of particularly kind of complex context for considering ethical concerns for network data that has led to both kind of who owns the data questions and how do we use the data questions that I think are both kind of important. And the former is particularly important given the number of studies that work kind of in singular contexts or controlled contexts that often require some negotiation of data access that sometimes come with riders of sharing, or not even necessarily riders of sharing data, but an increasing norm of data sharing in ways that I think we have to consider what those kind of implications of both the previous notes were. The last thing I'll say is the way I presented is kind of organized around the chapter on ethics from my book that Jim mentioned on collecting social network data that's in the Sage Little Green Book series. But there also are two special issues of the journal Social Networks, one from 2005 and one from 2021, that dive into a lot of these issues in more depth if there are kind of particular aspects of either one of those that are of concern to you. So I don't want to take up too much of our time recapping things. Hopefully that's a useful kind of way to overview. And if there are things that we need to talk about more, I'm happy to kind of revisit any of the topics that were in the presentation. But also, as Jim said, as my understanding of this session is this is intended to be kind of more opportunity for Q&A, and I suspect there are plenty of things in this domain that are worth talking about. And I'm hoping you all have questions because Jim seeded some things in email that he might ask that I really don't want to talk about. So hopefully others of you have your own projects, questions that are there. So anyway, mostly joking.
All right, anyone with questions then?
I'll ask a general question. Just, any kinds of advice for visualization, which you touched on. I have a COVID network study, and one of the things we're looking at is transmission through households. And once you start to group people by household, when you add several other attributes to the node, it's really not hard to really narrow down whom you might be talking about, especially in one small geographic area. So do you have any thoughts or advice for deciding which are the important attributes to show so that you can still get the whole picture of the network, but still protect privacy?
Yeah. So there's a number of answers to this that I think are out there that have, and as Anna mentions, like the kind of implications here are going to be highly dependent upon context, right? So different types of questions are going to lead to different potential barriers to kind of presenting things in this way. So the first thing I'd say is we've learned through mistakes or kind of experience that often the visuals that we like as network researchers often kind of lead to these kind of potential disclosure kind of complications. And so I think sometimes we need to reconsider the ways to deal with that. For example, I've always thought it kind of entertaining that in the AdHealth data, the romantic partner data have higher restrictions than the genetic data. It takes more to get access to those data. And so the reason I raise that is, visuals of those abound. There's a number of them out there. And even though I can't, so I've published a little paper that did kind of 4-cycle analysis of the GLEE network that I had constructed as teaching example. And in doing so, the journal wanted a comparison to the AdHealth data. It's like, I don't have access to the romantic tie data, but then I realized I could actually code it up from a figure. I could literally kind of manually generate the romantic tie data. So all that to say that often these visuals lead to things that the data themselves, the data agreements themselves might not always kind of allow. So the way I've seen kind of most usefully these kind of illustrated, particularly in the kind of question that Dana raised, is that we can often kind of present heuristic and or kind of synthetic networks that are useful for presenting the results that convey in the kind of network motif kind of verbiage that convey the kind of primary properties that are of importance for conveying findings that don't necessarily require presenting the particular exact network that we've analyzed, right? And so that's one thing that I think we under leverage, but are increasingly useful, particularly as the kind of literature on network motifs is becoming kind of more robust, as people are suggesting ways to kind of characterize and categorize the kind of prominent features. You all haven't had the discussion on kind of visualization fully yet in this workshop, correct? That's
not yet.
To come. So I'll punt a little bit on kind of what are the primaries to that one. But I think that kind of stylistic and or heuristic and or motif version is particularly helpful for avoiding some of these kind of ethical considerations. Addressing, I should say, avoiding the concerns, addressing them appropriately. The other way is the kind of another way that I've seen people dealing with this is by introducing, particularly into visuals, kind of small bits of noise that are going to kind of that are going to occlude some of those potentially kind of disclosing characteristics, but still maintain the implications for whatever it is you're trying to present analytically. Then the third thing that I'm increasingly seeing as well is presenting model-based results off of an individual kind of data set. And what I mean by that is if you run an ergom or you run a whatever kind of statistical model you're working within, then instead of presenting kind of the raw data as you collected it, you can present a simulated network off of the model results that kind of corresponds to the same patterns that are found in the data. And this is kind of similar to the motifs answer, but just in a different kind of framework. So that's some of them. There are other people who would kind of disagree with me on this and say that the power of networks is in our visuals, and I just think that can often be true, but doesn't necessarily need to be true off of the quote unquote raw data.
Thank you.
So I see some hands. going
Allison
up.
and then Gabe, maybe?
Yeah.
Hi, so I guess I'm wondering, like with egocentric network data where I have, they're reporting on their alters HIV status, do you get around the consent issue because it's just the ego's perception, so they're not necessarily revealing it? Is that how you get around that the alter didn't consent?
Well, there's that's one of the layers of the answers of ways to deal with this. And I mean, HIV, Al Klovedahl had a piece in the 2005 special issue that I mentioned where he kind of addressed this exactly. And that's one of his answers is that we, in the social sciences, there's this kind of robust literature on secondary subjects, which then we can think of as kind of particularly applicable to the notion of alters in the network context. But the main reason I bring up the secondary subjects is we don't have to, the network folks often think we have to invent kind of ways to deal with relational data. And the reality is that particular kind of concern is something that social scientists writ large have been dealing with for literally decades. And so we don't have to like invent that wheel. And the secondary subjects kind of literature has suggested one of the things that we can deal with is recognizing that perceptions of behaviors are different from kind of necessarily kind of realities of statuses or what have you. That's one. The second piece is often in an ego, if you're talking specifically for an egocentric network, context, often you don't need identifiers, right? So you can collect those kind of altered data anonymously, or at least pseudonymously, and so that's a secondary kind of strategy that is particularly kind of germane to questions where the kind of perceived risks might be greater in like an HIV context about, asking about alter attributes. But if we don't have if we have kind of those kind of two layers of protection that you don't know who the respondents are through confidentiality, and then you can collect their alter information anonymously, then that often kind of satisfies these requirements. So that actually probably would be my first answer, and then the second one would be the one you raised. But those I think are the kind of primary ways that, and the main reason I've mentioned those is that kind of separates the kind of consent version and the risk version. Even though IRBs often put those pieces together, I think it allows you to address each one of those pieces for their research. Now, that having been said, I haven't collected egocentric data on HIV in kind of an HIV context in probably more than 10 years. And so the kind of IRB space on like how they know to kind of handle these things has evolved a bit over that time period. And so it might be more standardized now, but my impression from talking to people is that it is still a little bit university by university. And this is like the weird thing for network people is that like often as soon as you go to an IRB for the first time, if your university isn't used to it, you're going to deal with the like, you're asking exactly in the way Allison asked the question, is that you're asking questions about people who haven't had the opportunity to consent, and your IRB is often going to want to shut that down. And so if your IRBs aren't familiar with this, often the kind of first person through at a university, A, has to set the standards, and B, gets to set the standards. So they become kind of negotiated processes in ways that I think is not as common as it was 10 years ago, because a lot of universities now have more experience with this, but we were all kind of having to have those individual conversations for long periods of time. So for whatever that's worth. Did I touch on the components there? Or I know I'm rambling a little bit, but I think it's in part because I've got like 8 different things going through my brain of what I want to answer here. And I know that we only have 30 minutes, so I'm trying not to take all of the time for each question.
I think just to quickly piggyback on that, I think the other thing is that if you are the first person in your university to go through an IRB, the good thing about the social networks community is that people are generally pretty generous. And so you can often send it to SocialNet and say help, and people will get you their protocols and share them and help. So there's a lot of, because there is a lot of both explicit and implicit, experience with this kind of thing that you can draw on.
Thank you, Allison, for asking that question. My question was actually quite similar, and I just want to extend it to something that Jim brought up earlier, which is the increase in data that is not so much perceived, but is actually real data on interactions, in particular when it comes to using technology. And we're seeing that appear increasingly. For my dissertation, I'm using in the same data set phone calls and text messages and proximity data, along with survey data and perceived networks. And you can't really get away with the, this is just a perception of their respondents sort of approach with that. And so I'd be curious to hear, where we're going with that particular. I know there's a lot of issues outside of social networks with the proximity data kind of stuff, but how's that going to affect the way that we interact with IRB?
And so there's a lot, and I'm sure other people have some thoughts on this too. But the first thing I'd say is this is where the kind of risk level question becomes kind of the primary concern for most IRBs, right? And if we're talking about things that are relatively low kind of stakes, there's some ways to address the primary concern there with that. That's the first piece. The second piece, though, is the one that I think is most open for discussion right now, is the kind of how data were collected and for what purpose, as compared to kind of what uses they're being put to, right? And I think that this is something that is rapidly becoming renegotiated, particularly in the social sciences, as we're seeing an increased move towards kind of the kind of open data, open science kind of practices, as the notions for kind of what it means to share and make use of such data for purposes other than what it was collected for becomes I don't think we have an answer to that. That's the short version of I think this is something that we're very much negotiating. And I would argue that in that data space, the network specific considerations they don't take us to a kind of qualitatively different space than the kind of individual level sets of questions, because there's already often kind of high precision and high kind of data volume about individuals that the questions I just raised are already kind of what's being negotiated, independent of the relational notions of it. Now the relational aspects of it, I think this is where the data, there's kind of two tiers of question that I think are worth addressing. One is data use agreements kind of matter hugely here, right? So how you got the access, how you got access to the data, and kind of what you're planning to do with it is often going to restrict those sorts of questions. Kind of what's able. And then the second piece is kind of the third piece of the overall part of the kind of answer here, and that is, I think we often think of IRBs as kind of hurdles that have to get passed, and I think that is somewhat true, but they also should be considered a floor. And what I mean by that is often their standards are kind of lower than we probably need to kind of consider on our own. And so this is kind of the types of things with those sorts of data that I would want to consider above and beyond what the IRB is going to require, is this kind of question of how I'm going to present it, in the kind of IRBs aren't used to kind of thinking in the potential ramifications of a relational notion of deductive disclosure, for example. And so like how we're going to make use of and present such data need to have the kind of same standards of what is a cell space, they would have at the individual level, and how few of any one thing am I going to report on is going to be necessary. So this is where like presenting in models and presenting in aggregate results often is more kind of the approach that kind of meets the aims of ethical standards than is kind of considering kind of what I can present, if that makes sense. And so that's where I think we're heading. Is going to be kind of more the other thing is off that when you do get to your actual visuals discussion, if you haven't already kind of watched those talks, is often we present visuals that are more that we think are more useful than they are. I can't tell you how many times I review papers where I have no idea what the visual I just looked at is meant to convey. And so like, and the main reason I raise that in respect to this is I think that they often, the communication and the kind of ethical things are both kind of leading me to the same point. Leave it out, is sometimes the answer here, because it raises more concerns than it solves in that case. So
Well,
I don't know if that got all the way to your question, but what's that, Jim?
And the argument would be if you don't know why it's there, it's probably also not revealing much. So
yeah, we've all heard the phrase the hairball,
Right,
if you haven't, you will soon hear the kind of phrase a hairball network, and that's because oftentimes these kind of big giant networks, when you present a big kind of a big network, it turns into a hairball that's hard to make much sense of.
To flip it around though, I think, I mean, just, and someone else should jump in if I'm stepping in the way, but I'm curious to hear Jimmy's thoughts on this. But the other brand, what we're talking about right now is a lot of the kind of work that we do to publish papers. What if we're consultants for, I don't know, a school district or something that wants us to understand, a fight amongst teachers. And so we decide that the principal says, come and map the relationships among all my teachers so that we can then have a powwow about it. In that case, often, putting up the visual is meant to be the thing that gets people talking and acknowledging where the gaps are.
Yeah. And this is something that I should probably say at the outset, I'm not sure I'm in the majority on in the field. My view on this is that we as a field have advanced to a point of being really good at predicting on the average, right? But predicting or explaining for individual relationships or individual nodes, I would argue that we often are overstating what our capacities are. And so the example that Jim just raised, right? We could, if you give me a bunch of classrooms or a bunch of schools, I think we could kind of identify unique positions that are likely to be in, in conflict or what have you. But, if we're trying to identify the source of a single conflict, I think that sometimes our methods are going to fall short of being able to do that. So this is where my answer to that is often going to be that that if I were asked to do something like that, I would say that I think I can predict the types of things that are likely to give rise to that, if a school is asking that. But if you're looking for kind of, the individual relationships or individual teachers that are likely to be the ones that need to be kind of intervened upon, I'm going to suggest that our tools aren't necessarily as equipped for that as they probably would like. And so this becomes like a question that I answer kind of in advance, and it would say, I'm not sure that we can give you the answers you're after. And if we could, I'm not sure I would be willing to, for a variety of reasons. And that second piece is the one that I think there's more disagreement upon in the consulting. Right. For whatever that's worth. I tend to be pretty cautious in such things, I guess is the way.
I'm probably the other end of the pole, but that's a different story. And I've yet to see, it's interesting, that's a different story. We'll have a beer sometime.
I started out as, that's interesting though. I mean, we both started out on projects that had some pretty severe restrictions placed upon them. I was working in HIV research in Malawi, and the kind of multi-layers of ethical approval there just made us kind of default to everything anonymous as much as possible, even in an outward context. And I mean, if you're ever bored, the history of AdHealth essentially getting shut down the first time around is kind of entertaining reading. But I'm sure that caused problems for you in the kind of efforts for collecting those data in the first place, or maybe not.
No, yeah, but the issue it got shut down had nothing to do with ethics. It was everything to do with politics, right? So that's a different story entirely. And I think that the AdHealth case is a great one. So the sexual network graph, that you can now download it from the Snap archive if you want, because Mark Newman literally did what Jimmy did and just coded it from the diagram. But so what? Right? It's like it comes with absolutely no covariance. So who cares, right? So it's from a data security standpoint, no one is identifiable and nothing is at risk. So from that standpoint, like it's complete information, but it's such a thin slice of the complete information as to be, useless.
So for a healthy a healthy dose of small disagreement, in the Romantic Network that is kind of publicly available, right? The paper that you all published in 2004, right? One of the big ideas was that there 4 cycles are avoided. Well, in the visual, there are 2 4 cycles. Those 2 4 cycles overlap on 3 people. If I know that I'm one of those 3 people, right? I can figure out who the others are. Now, AdHealth is, now I would have been in that cohort. So it's old. So I'm probably not so much concerned with who my partners were partnered with way back then. But I think it highlights an example, right? That seemingly relatively straightforward and kind of protected sorts of things could unravel pretty quickly in that context. And so if your data are more timely, I would have a slightly different answer than Jim had, given the kind of historical nature of those data in that particular respect. And and that's just meant to be one example. There are many ways. The main reason I raise that is there are many ways that network data lead to different disclosure risks than individual level data, where if you can identify, there's all these analyses out there in computer science, et cetera, that show if, you combine 6 or 7 variables in an individual level data set, if you know somebody's in the data, you could probably figure out who they are. In this case, you do that with one person, then you can often do that with multiple people, and even without sometimes even without the attribute data is the point there.
Right, and I certainly agree that that's possible, though there's absolutely no way that everyone in that high school didn't already know that, right? And so like you're not telling them something they don't already know. Just like when you go into a school and show people that, the white teachers don't get along with the black teachers, they already know it, right? And so there's nothing about putting it on the screen that makes that, like, it's providing them with information that they don't know. It's just providing them with information they can't deny. And so I think that that actually has a pretty transformative effect on what people are doing. So, so I suspect that there's so anyway, my sense is that one of the issues is this notion of identifiability is in part a problem because we promise people that they won't be identified. And so if the informed consent when you start is, we're going to use names, welcome, if you want to opt out, that's an option. But I think that in some sense that's we're using public data. So, there you have it. I'm a little less, I'm a little less, I don't know, I'm a little more jaded on people's, what we already know about people than I guess. I think that, we're fighting an information war with both hands behind our backs when Google's already gone out and done it. So it strikes me that there's a bit there. So
yeah, no, that wasn't meant to raise an ethical concern about the way that's
right.
been presented, because I don't think there are, but I just think it highlights the need to think about the kind of implications of these recommendations in a slightly different light.
Right. Yeah.
And that's where the other one that has come to light if we're talking about these kind of big data sorts of things is that the kind of the availability of data versus the kind of uses of those data versus the then kind of implications of presenting the uses of those data. Revealing things that are known can often in and of itself be very different. Revealing things that are in publicly available data can often be kind of qualitatively different things than that the data are available themselves. And so this is something that, research does, and we just have to be cognizant of the implications of those choices more than kind of shying away from doing them. I'm not trying to argue that we can't do them. I'm saying I think we have to be careful about the ways we go about doing so. There was a great example of that in the there was the publicly released data of, I forget which one of the pay for dating sites, and people were able to identify people who are essentially cheating on their partners, et cetera, out of those data, and they were only quote unquote metadata.
Right. Other questions or thoughts? Awesome. Really appreciate you doing this, Jimmy. If there are other questions, if you have an IRB question or you're in the process of getting a project going and you want to bounce some of these ideas around, we're all available by email and such. So, don't be shy. Otherwise, thanks much.
Thank you all.
Thank you. And we now have a short lunch break, so let's go ahead and take a half hour, and we'll come back about 1 o'clock and pick up on some actual get your hands dirty with R kind of stuff. So.